Good afternoon. Yeah, that's a great start. Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me so far? Am I yelling? All right, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here today to today's event, Fiction and Nonfiction in a Time of Catastrophe, Intellectuals Fleeing Under German Occupation. I'm Alice Conklin from the History Department, and along with my colleague at the end of the table, Bruno, Cabanes, fellow historian, obviously, we feel so fortunate in having two stunning guests to share their work with us today. Before introducing each of them, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, the History Department, the Department of French and Italian, and Benjamin Hoffman from the Centre d'Excellence, also in the French Department. As the sponsorship suggests, our goal today is to bring into conversation an author of historical fiction and a professional historian, both whom have written celebrated accounts of the same event in the past. The harrowing but also boring Atlantic crossing aboard a cargo ship made by a group of French intellectuals escaping Vichy France in 1941. And that's the story that's going to be the center of our dialogue today. So let me introduce our guests in turn. Adrien Bosc is a star with a global audience whose books have been translated in at least 10 languages. He has, moreover, 2 strings to his bow. He is not only a novelist, but a publisher, having founded the press known as Les Éditions du Sous-Sol. I will talk briefly about his writing career, but keep in mind that as a writer and a publisher, he has, in his own words, pursued the same goal. And I quote, inventive, hybrid literature that ventures off the beaten path to explore, reconfigure, and interrogate the interplay between reality and fiction. So his first novel, Constellation, was a bestseller in France when released in 2014. It won the coveted Grand Prix du Roman de l'Académie Française and appeared in English under the same title in 2018. It imaginatively retold the tragic story of a 1949 Air France passenger jet which slammed into the side of a mountain in the Azores, killing all 37 passengers and 11 crew on board. In 2018, Adrien Bosc released Capitaine, which he will be discussing today. His third novel, Colonne, was released earlier this year, and it explores the rather doleful period in which the young Jewish philosopher and mystic Simone Weil, like so many European intellectuals on the left in the interwar years, headed to Spain to join the international brigades fighting against Franco. For Weil, much like George Orwell, the experience contributed to a disillusionment with the left. Colonne brings to a close Adrien Bosc's brilliant reverse trilogy of true life novels in C. They all start with a C, you may have noticed. 3 titles which collectively span the traumatic mid-20th century years for France and Europe more generally. While intellectuals figure prominently in each of these accounts, so too do others with instant name recognition, political leaders, sporting figures, for example. And central to our discussion today, Adrien Bosc always integrates archival and primary sources into his beautifully crafted and haunting narratives. So we're thus privileged to have Adrien Bosc among us today and to put him in conversation with an equally talented and distinguished writer, my fellow traveler in the field of French colonial history, Professor Eric Jennings. Professor Jennings holds the title at the University of Toronto of Distinguished Professor of History of France and the Francophone World. I can think of no modern French historian as simultaneously productive, innovative, erudite, and well-known on both sides of the Atlantic as Eric Jennings. Eric has completed 5 major books published in English and French on topics as varied as the Vichy regime in France's overseas colonies, spas in the French Empire from Vichy itself to Dalat in Vietnam, the French resistance during World War II in Brazzaville, Equatorial Africa, and most recently his 2018 work, Escape from Vichy, the refugee exodus to the French Caribbean, based on 20 years of archival research. One of its major achievements is to integrate Martinique not only into the history of World War II in an entirely new way, but also into the history of post-war intellectual and social movements. In all of his work, Eric Jennings has shown an unparalleled ability to transcend national boundaries, breathing new life into the field of French colonial history. Much of his originality lies in using local archives in France's former colonies to complement the central archives found in Paris and places like Aix-en-Provence. This approach has allowed him to see how colonialism really works on the ground and to grant agency to the colonized, which in turn has opened up many new questions about how imperial power worked. His range is equally impressive as he constantly moves from one new big topic to the next, and he's currently working on a history of vanilla, a very French colonial product, if you were wondering. So Eric Jennings too writes with uncommon verve and grace, rendering sophisticated concepts drawn from such fields as cultural history, gender theory, whiteness studies, and the history of medicine and warfare into narratives that always reach a wide reading public. So given the amazing talents of our speakers today, let me stop talking and turn the floor over to them. In terms of our format, our conversation will roughly fall into 3 parts with time at the end for Q&A, in which we wish you and hope you will all participate. The first part will focus on the actual voyage, onboard experiences of our intellectual titans. Here, Eric Jennings will launch our discussion appropriately with a slide presentation of conditions in France in 1941 to help orient us. The second part will be a general exchange among the 4 of us about sort of fact and fiction. And the third part of the conversation will turn to the arrival of the passengers in Martinique, where conditions were not what they expected. Here, too, we will have a few slides to share. Martinique was never intended to be the final destination, but few of those on board the Paul Lemaire expected to be stranded there. And throughout the presentations, we invite you to reflect on 2 questions: how historical writing and fictional recreations of historical events complement each other, and what historians and novelists can learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you to the organizers and sponsors of this event. I'm going to actually head to the podium because I realize that I can't make the slides move. No, I'll go over there. I'll make it easier to speak to the slides as well. So I promise not to go for 15 minutes here, but I wanted to set the historical stage. And to do so, I'll begin by listing these 3 things that I want to try to do over 15 minutes. The little insert that you're seeing here is from a newspaper that was run out of New York, and you'll see it's from 1941, and it's advertising the passage from Marseille to Martinique, this avenue of escape that both Adrien and I have studied. So these first maps to situate you, obviously France gets carved up into several bits in 1940 after the German onslaught. We're talking about the chunk of France that remains unoccupied until November 1942, that's in light green. And on the right, you have some of the lists of camps that have gone from the late 30s to camps that had inmates that were really, refugees, Spanish Republican refugees, Italian anti-fascist refugees, German Jewish anti-Nazi refugees, to all of a sudden under Vichy camps for undesirables that by 1942 are going to become antechambers de Drancy, which itself becomes an antechamber to Auschwitz. So this story is very contingent. It's set in 1941 when escape was still possible. I want to stress that that was no longer possible just a year onwards. So you're looking here at the former tile manufactory of Les Milles that becomes a camp. Again, it has at least 4 different lives, this camp. First as a center for Spanish Republican refugees, then a center for German anti-Nazi refugees and Austrian as well. And then as of really the end of 41, it becomes a place out of which you can't escape Whereas prior to that, it had been a place where if you had your papers to go to the New World, for instance, you were allowed to leave. So this is a history in stages. One of the very many famous people who went through, and again, Adrien's novel wonderfully lists some of these personalities that all of us will be able to relate to that have transited through this route. One of the ones who was in Les Milles in 1939 was none other than Max Ernst, who famously sketched this drawing, which is called the Stateless, the Städtlose in German, which really refers to the fact that refugees are so dehumanized that they're reduced to the state of files, wanting to escape. This is even before the Nazis invade, right? So you can imagine how grim conditions become later on. All right, so where do the refugees go? Well, Martinique is but one of several locations on a kind of laundry list, if you will, and this list evolves over time. Laundry list is not the right word, it really is salvation list, really, because people want to get out, and they've ranked different places based on opportunity. Famously, the US is closing its doors at this time, so too is Canada, so too is gradually Mexico, Cuba, etc. So it's a story of doors slamming one after another. So what options remain? Palestine is on lots of people's list. So too, interestingly, is Shanghai. I don't have time to go there, but there are various options. The Martinique one is interesting because if you're legally a refugee in France in 1940, which not all of these refugees are, but if you're legally on French soil, then there's really nothing theoretically blocking you from going to Martinique, which was also considered French soil. Just a few years later, Martinique would be officially integrated into France, and at this point, we're almost there in 1940. So it is a bit of a shortcut in that even if you don't have papers to enter the US, and you may have a sort of other connection, you can get to Martinique. So word of mouth is spreading amongst these refugee camps. Remember, these are not extermination camps, right? These are refugee camps that have turned into prison camps. Word starts spreading about this Martinique option. This is my rough translation of a song that you see on the left in the original French, just of a couple verses. Do you know the Antilles? That's where we should live as a family. What is the object of all your dreams? Paradise, Martinique. Where does one drink rum like milk? Where do the Cohens and the Millers dream of? Oh, Martinique, the sun would shine and my heart would bound. Oh, Martinique, if I were in your arms. So the question then becomes, how do these convoys of boats end up going to Martinique? These are boats that are mixed cargoes, as the French call them. They're not passenger liners. I estimate, based on my calculations, that about 5,000 refugees escaped in this way between the fall of France in June 1940 to the end of the Martinique exodus route in May 1941. So a sizable number of people. Barry and Fry obviously led a humanitarian organization. He was mandated by Eleanor Roosevelt, amongst others, to try to save personalities, individuals, famous artists, famous intellectuals. But clearly he didn't understand what exactly was going on, because as this passage makes clear, he thinks of the arrival of the Martinique route as something almost providential. Indeed, he leverages it. This is a telegram that he sends to some of the sponsors of the Emergency Rescue Committee saying that he fears momentarily the announcement by Vichy of a decree interrupting the Marseille-Martinique shipping route, thus cutting the best avenue of escape. Yet he doesn't actually know how this best avenue of escape was set up. Here are the lists of boats that found their way from Marseille to Martinique between 1940 and 1941. If you look carefully, you'll see that both the Paul Le Maire, the Wyoming, and the Winnipeg make several trips across the Atlantic, back and forth. So this is a considerable number of ships undertaking this voyage. Nowadays, I'm guessing what? It would probably take 6 days. In 1940-41, as Adrien knows, some of these boats took well over a month because they stopped in Oran, they feared interception, they feared dangers at sea. Adrien's book does a wonderful job talking about the fear of submarines, the fear of subversives, etc. So they did really cabotage down the West African coast, basically as far as Mauritania, and then crossed the Atlantic, sometimes in a zigzaggy pattern. This is the secret that I uncovered around 2000 in the French Colonial Archives, the kind of bizarre genesis of the Martinique route, which I argue is at once a rescue and an expulsion. This is the orders of Vichy's Interior Minister, Marcel Péruton, saying, we want to get rid of these people for two reasons. One, the rules of humanity, and the other is that, and this is my words, paraphrasing him, they're parasites, and they're not producing anything for the community. So it's this very ambiguous language. He only sets this plan into motion after having first tried, along with the upper hierarchy of Vichy, to get other nations to accept the refugees in France. The United States, Argentina, you name it. One after another shut him down. And so the Martinique route really is a last-ditch effort to get people out. You might say save people, depending on your interpretation. To get people out, to get rid of them is the other way of looking at it. And what's so interesting is that, of course, it is this last route that is possible for these refugees. So when I started researching this, like Adrien and Bosc, I was aware that many personalities were on board, and I set about rather naively writing to them. And this is what Claude Levi-Strauss wrote back to me in 1997. I no longer live at that address, so I feel I need to change it. So he wrote back saying this extraordinary thing, which is, this is in the fourth paragraph. What were the motives of Vichy to let me go, or to let this boat go? I have no idea. My suspicion at the time that it might be transporting clandestine material without the Germans or English knowing it were rendered possible by the erratic zigzagging of the boat off of the African coast, and these thoughts were based on rumor. So at the time, rumors were that there could be something illegal on board, and that's why the ships were zigzagging. The role of rumor, by the way, is really important in Capitaine as well. As for the experience of the refugees, well, it too lends itself to this dual analysis of this being at once rescue and expulsion. Consider the case of the Austrian Jewish refugees, Harry and Maria Chrishaber, both of them trade unionists, who, of course, many of these refugees had first fled their country of origin, Austria. Then some of them had gone to places like Prague, had to flee Prague. Then they had to, of course, anyway, they'd gone to Paris and then to the south. These are refugees, right? These are people who are now sometimes on their fifth migration. And here they are, stuck in France, realizing the doors are closing. And they receive this letter, a copy of which I found in Frankfurt, another copy of which I found in Albany, New York. Anyway, the letter that they received says, I have the honor of informing you that in view of an imminent collective departure of emigrants, you are to be sent to Marseille with your family. Please present yourself to the Montauban train station on February 21st at 11 a.m. An escort will await you holding your passport and your visa. So if this were an expulsion, which it seems to be, right? You're going to be given back your passport, you're going to be escorted there, you're being thrown out. It's a collective departure. If it were indeed an expulsion, it was one that the Chrishabers met with bounds of joy because they wanted to get out. But I think this nicely encapsulates this complexity. Some of these refugees are, again, negotiating options, right? So this is a conversation in writing between Erich Itor Kahn and his wife Frida Kahn, both of them very gifted musicians, trying to get out. Erich has been imprisoned at Les Milles. His wife is in a hotel at Marseille. This was not uncommon for the male to be interned and the female and the same couple to be in a hotel. So they had to write each other. They're both German Jewish musicians. They write to each other in French, which is probably their fourth or third shared language. So this begs the question of why. I have different theories, one of which is they've rejected German. Another is that they know that Vichy censors are going to read their letters anyway, and they might as well just make it easier for them. So what's so interesting about this is that Erich and Frida are balancing possibilities. She's saying, let's go to Martinique. And at one point in the correspondence, and I don't think I actually have this here, he says, does it really make sense to give up, why are we trading internment in the south of France for internment in Martinique? They're just going to throw us in a camp there too. And of course, she was right, because internment in Martinique turned out to be far safer. Another superstar on board, a German Jewish novelist, Anna Segers, who famously writes about the travails that these refugees go through trying to get visas. From the US consulate in Marseille, from the Mexican consulate in Marseille, and the endless queues that they spend being berated and humiliated. And then sometimes, occasionally, somebody reaches out to help with kindness. In this instance, the most implausible act of kindness of all, a French functionary reaching out, telling them that she is going to help save them. And she was one of these people for whom an entire people will be saved, writes Anna Segers. One of the great joys in my project came when I interviewed Anna Segers' son, who looked at one of the photos that I had and said, yes, this very well might be the person that helped us. So I know that's not definitive proof, but it is something. Again, this was an act that was very complicated, this crossing. Is it, Vichy getting rid of people? Is it an act of complicity? Is it an act of generosity? Or is it an act of hostility? You see all of this wrapped up in one in the case of German Jewish poet Walter Mehring, who again, like many of these figures, he'd written, things criticizing Hitler, he was Jewish, he had every reason to want to get out of town. Well, here he is trying to get out. And as he reaches the passport controls and the exit controls, he's told by the French officer that the French officer needs to call headquarters, calls the prefecture. By this point, Walter Mehring is probably gnawing at his nails, and the French gendarme comes back and says, well, maybe this is another Walter Mehring scram. So this is clearly an act of complicity, and it's a major one, because Mehring was on the list, the famous Kunt Commission list, which both Adrien, Bosc, and I talk about. The Germans had drawn up a list of people that Vichy had to hand over, quote, on demand, surrender on demand, according to the armistice clauses. Next to these cases of harrowing escapes, there's cases of tragic near misses. These two characters, Rudolf Breitscheid and Rudolf Hilferding, both leading figures of the Weimar Republic. One of the two Jewish, the other not. They both were on the cusp of escaping. They were told by the maritime company, oh, your social standing is such that you can't just be in a bunk. Why don't you wait till the next ship where we can get you a proper cabin? Well, in the meantime, the Gestapo gets hold of them. They both end up murdered, one right away, the other near the end of the war. Here are the ships that we're talking about. Again, Adrien Bosc's novel deals with one of these ships. They all share features in that none of them are passenger liners. There are all these mixed cargoes. This is photographer Ilse Bing, again, a German Jewish refugee, a great surrealist photographer, taking a picture while about to leave Marseille. Gives you a sense of the ship. Same photographer taking a few of the passengers on board. So there are regular passengers going back to Martinique, and then there's all of these refugees, right? And there's definite suspicions on board. Here's one of the more famous shots that both of us have embraced for our covers. It is taken by Dinah Lowenstein, and what was amazing about it the first time I encountered it in Washington at the U.S. Holocaust Museum was that Dinah Lowenstein had left these little Post-its on it with these names. So obviously some of these are people you would instantly recognize, and we'll talk about at greater length, like Victor Serge, or the great Afro-Cuban Sino-Afro-Cuban painter Wilfredo Lam, and others would be, parfaits inconnus, as you would say in French, people you've never heard of before and that you can Google and not find any information about. More pictures of the boats. Adrien Bosc talks about the transats. The transats are clearly seen here, those boat chairs. This is Adrien Bosc's picture. This is Jacques Rémy's picture of the crossing of the Tropic of Cancer, showing these celebrations on board with this Neptune-related a ritual, which goes way back, actually, in the history of sailing, which I'm sure Adrien might want to talk more about. This is a photo by anti-Nazi Czech artist Antonin Peltz, showing the grim conditions in the dorms when the two Rudolphs were told not to take these ships because they weren't very luxurious. They weren't kidding, they weren't very luxurious. This is a sort of bunk bed setup. These are the latrines on board. Interesting to see people washing their laundry, and then a kind of makeshift quote-unquote ladies' room behind them here that you can see. And then, of course, some of these refugees are thinking out loud about what it means to be a refugee. This is Adolf Hofmeister talking about some of the adages, right? A refugee is an unwilling tourist, some of them opine on board. There's some quite wonderful self-defining going on from people, many of whom are now stateless. They've been stripped of their citizenship by Hitler or Mussolini, to give just two examples. Well, I didn't want to speak more than 15 minutes. I think I might have actually succeeded. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for recontextualizing the voyage we are going to discuss today together. I want to switch to the second part of the discussion with Adrien about his work as a novelist, as Alice reminded us at the beginning of this public event. You are the author of three major novels. The first one, Constellation on this story of these 37 passengers who died in the crash of their planes in the Azores in October of 1949. Of course, Capitaine, whom we are going to talk about today, and Conklin about Simone Weil. So I guess my first question is about the origins of the project, right? Why and how did you get interested in this group of passengers? Is it reading Anna Seger's novel Transit, or is it a photograph that you reproduce on the cover of your book, both on the French version and on the American version? The photograph that you just presented, Eric. So how does a project like this one start, and also what makes a good story for a novelist like you?
Hello, and thank you to be here. I try to speak. I try to be clear today with my basic in English. So just to explain the whole project, but I think, and if I remember, the beginning of the writing of the trilogy, we can say it's a trilogy. The only one was not clear was Capitaine. The first one, Constellation, was really an idea from the beginning, and the story of Simone Weil was from the beginning. In all the novel, you have a question of a mystery inside. Of course, this is 3 novels about, you say, beginning with say, but it's not a good explanation for the whole project. But it's 3 travel in the past, but 3 travel in different ways. You have the plane, you have the boat, at the end, the column with during the Spain, which is like a column of walking of soldiers. Mm-hmm. So but the idea from the beginning was not to be in the proper chronological order, but to begin from 1949 and to finish with the Spanish War in 1936, but like an idea also to re-explain the whole period by to make another order, to try another path. There is in all the book 3 mysteries. So in the first book there is a story with in Constellation with the plane, but also with the question of 2 violins, because there is a musician player inside the plane, really famous, Ginette Neveu. There is 2 real amazing characters in the plane, really famous.
Edith Piaf's lover.
Edith Piaf's lover was Marcel Cerdan, and the story is maybe the most famous story because Edith Piaf at this time fell in love with Marcel Cerdan. He was one of the biggest boxing players at this time. He just lost his match against Jacques Lamotta, and there was a revenge, and he decided to take the boat, but he received a call like 2 days before from Edith Piaf, who said, take the plane, the boat is too long. So the book is about fatality, fate. Sorry, the question of the surrealist said, and that's the link with the second one. We said hasard objectif. Objectif, I don't know how to translate. Chance, like coincidence, and that's the idea of the first book. And the other mystery, in a way, the other thing was in the third book with Simone Weil, the idea of Lost Later, Road to Bernanos. And there was the link between the 2 books. For me, it was from the beginning. And I'm working at the beginning, I was working on the second novel on the idea of not the boat, but a community in Marseille called Les Croque-Fruits. Maybe you know them. It's an amazing story of cooperative, an enterprise created by surrealists to, a lot of people in the boat works in Croque-Fruits. It was like created by 2 brothers. One was a surrealist, The other one was a chemical engineer. And they create, I don't know how to translate, but they create like we said une barre céréalière. It's a cereal bar with all the products non-forbidden or not restrictive in Marseille, like pistache, like nuts, so they create like this bar, but it was to say only to create something to work and it became like a large success in the south of France and became like a healthy enterprise, really. And they create a cooperative, so it was also a social model during this time. And they became, during the war, a center of the resistance in the south of France. So that was the beginning. And working on this cooperative, I read many letters or writing about Paul Le Merle. And that's why I began and I saw this picture, saw different picture. And also because I wanted to have a kind of mystery in each book, I saw that the Paul Le Merle was more linked with my project because, of course, this is a travel, the story of a travel, but also because at the beginning I thought there is no photographies. No, maybe two, this one, another one, like Antonin Peck, but I just discovered in the book of Eric. I saw one painting of the concentration camp in Martinique, but no pictures. But I know that in the boat there were Germaine Krull, who was one of the most important photographers just before the war. She not creates documentary photography, but she was really an avant-garde in this kind of photography. So I was so surprised that there was no photography with this kind of character inside the boat. So it was like a quest for me, like the center of the book. There is no photography, so I can write a novel because I don't have a picture. It's the beginning of the. There is a blank. There is something missing, and but this is not the end of the story. But at the end, we found the photographies. We found all the photography lost. And it was like a kind of I don't know. Happy ending for the historical part. So, to be maybe shorter, next question, but to explain the whole project. And the funny thing is that Paul Le Merle was not at the beginning in the project.
So tell us more about the kind of documentation process. So let's enter the novelist's workshop, so to speak. So how do you work? So you said you mentioned the photographs, but you also go to the archives. Do you use letters, for instance, right? I mean, you quote the letters that Claude Levi-Strauss wrote to his parents that are very moving and funny too. When you so how do you work, and what maybe differentiates your work as a novelist from Eric's work?
I'm not I don't really like when novelists say it's really different. We don't have the same process. So, but we like the idea of we can write everything we want because it's not. I'm really don't like. I really don't like this kind of writing, and I don't like when there is this arrogance in a way of the novelist to say I'm free because it's a license of poetry. I don't like that. So because I'm a huge because I'm really maybe I'm a huge fan of a lot of works of historian, and for me it's really important to make the same kind of research from the beginning. Maybe more amateur in a way, but to try to collect the maximum of information before before writing. So
Okay.
it's like compiling a lot of notes, compiling a lot of maps, a lot of archives, a lot of photographies. Also because it's important for me to see exactly inside the boat and not to write something wrong, something which is fiction, but in the wrong sense, something really that I can regret. So for me, it's really important to collect the maximum information, and there is like 2 or 3 years of documentation before for this kind of book. So working on the archive in Aix or Martinique, but also to go on the island.
Yes, you went to Martinique for you.
And to see also the landscape, to see the Lazare, the concentration camp, and destroyed now, but to collect, because also I think it's maybe the most interesting part, but the most funny part for a novelist, because you have like all this research, and at the end you can begin to write and to be inside. And as you said, I really think that there is a beautiful book in France, an essay of Yvan Jablonka called L'Histoire. So the history is a contemporary literature. That's the title. But I think it means something. And we can use and create some collage, some cut-up of different verbatim, different extract to create a new, I don't know, piece of art, but a new text, a new proposition of literature. And that's why it's, I think it's the best for a Capitaine, the best answer to André Breton, because it's horrible. When you begin to write about Capitaine, you know that inside there is a guy, a writer, called André Breton, who declares the end of the novel, who declares that the novel is something old, it's something we have to destroy. And you pretend to work on a novel. So it's like an oxymoron, it's like a contradiction. So you have to create new way also, and to work as they work, so as the collage, and also to find a way to, and I think the document and the postcard are also in a way kind of piece of art when you make some montage, we said. So that's the Lazare now, in a way, Mélancolie des ruines. So that's a process in a way.
About the voyage itself, your book begins and ends with a phrase I think borrowed from Leibniz. I really like, we cannot know the taste of pineapple by listening to travelers' tales. So what was the main challenge for you as a novelist when you try to capture the experience of crossing the Atlantic? Is it the experience of fear, of exile, of isolation, of uncertainty, of the experience of adventure, maybe, right? Because it's like an odyssey. And you chose to focus on the several specific big figures, but what about there were, for instance, many children, right, on board as well? So do you try to integrate them in the story as well? So again, what is the main challenge when you try to capture these?
Your question is maybe my answer in a way.
Okay,
no, it's exactly the answer. That I collect all this information, but at the end, my idea is to emphasize all the feelings inside, to try to. This question is not a sentence only to put the sentence of Leibniz because it's it's because it says something really important about maybe the work of a novelist. It's to the taste of something, the taste, the smell, the taste, and at the end maybe you have this feeling, and I think when I told the story to Eric before our conversation, but I received one letter, the only letter I received from one of the survivor of this travel is a letter of Au Breton, so the daughter of André Breton, but she was 6 years old during the travel, and she just sent a letter to paraphrase and to play with the quotes of the Leibniz, and said it was not the taste of the pineapple. What I
Candies, you say right?
say like a berlingot. We say
kind of thing,
it's a milk really
yeah.
with a lot of sugar.
Yeah.
So because she eat a lot of kind of things, drinks travel. So for me it was really the best letter I can receive, because it was really the purpose of the book. And at the end there is another sentence also who can summarize the idea of the book. Inside is a quote of Glissant, the Martiniquez poet, and there is a grave of Glissant, of course, in Martinique. And on his grave, I discovered when I went to Martinique, and I went to the grave of Glissant, and there is a phrase who really was the intention of the book. Is rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant. It means nothing is true, but everything is alive. So that means if it's moving, if it's alive in the book, it could be true. It's not a question in a way, but there is all the thing with the documentation. But inside, I have to create this feeling for the reader.
Thank you, Adrien. We'll come back to your work as a novelist. It's time for us to move to Martinique, to the third part of the discussion. And
Okay, I'll go back to the slides here. Let's see if I can restart. I'm afraid technologically this is a problem, so I'm just going to do this. Okay, so upon arrival in Martinique, what happened? Well, André Breton, Victor Serge, and others have described the bile, the hate that gets poured onto these refugees, Claude Levi-Strauss as well, as if, there's this pent-up resentment that France has defeated, and these people have been so far away from France, they spill out their bile on these incoming refugees. They describe them as un-French or non-French or anti-French. Germaine Krull hypothesizes that these must be Nazis because they can't. She even says some of them have these blockheads and khaki uniforms. I think Germaine Krull is sort of confronted with all sorts of memories of her own country having fallen to the Nazis. Anyway, and sure enough, in the archives you have these forms that the customs officials were given, and they were to ask, are you married? Okay, fairly standard, I suppose. Do you have children? But also, have you ever been condemned? How much money do you have with you? Have you ever been involved in politics, and if so, with which party? This is where André Breton gets told, you can do what you want here, but don't do any writing, don't do any politics. As for black people, they're big children, don't deal with them. So these people are being told, stick to yourselves. And Breton is already punished right off the bat. He's told, most French citizens are allowed to stay in a hotel in town. Only foreigners are going into the Lazare camp. But because you're suspicious to us politically, we're throwing you in with the foreigners. So then, a series of subcategories. Here's what you do with somebody if they've arrived with proper visas. Here's what you do with somebody who's still awaiting their visa. One thing I didn't mention is the vast majority of these refugees only stay in Martinique under a month. Why? Because the governor of Martinique has insisted he's okay with this scheme, not really, but only if no more than 400 refugees stay at a time in Martinique. So in order for one refugee to arrive, another refugee has to leave, and it's a sort of rotating door system. All right, then on to the photos that both Adrien Bosc and I have seen. This is from the Germaine Krull collection. So Germaine Krull has also been a fil conducteur, a thread through my work, because I also encountered her when researching Free French Africa. She ends up leaving Martinique for Guyana. From Guyana, she goes to Brazil. Brazil, she joins the Free French. General de Gaulle sends her. She's a world-renowned photographer. Man Ray famously said, "You and I are the two greatest photographers alive." Very modest of Man Ray. But anyway, so she ends up in Brazil. She signs up with the Free French. They immediately send her to Brazzaville, where she becomes the official photographer of the Free French, and she takes two sets of photos, those that the Free French keep and use for propaganda purposes, and those that they don't want that involve abuses of all kinds that she keeps on her person and remain with her until late in her life when she donates them to the Conklin Museum, which interestingly is a museum that has been looted of its so-called degenerate art by the Nazis. So there's interesting ways in which the story comes full circle. Anyway, she and Peltz are the only two who take photos from inside this camp. She ironically calls it, I'm using air quotes, a concentration camp in Martinique because she complains endlessly to the authorities about how badly they're treated. And she says at one point, how would this look to the Americans if they saw a concentration camp in Martinique? She also objects, incidentally, to white inmates being guarded by black guards. So there's all sorts of racist hierarchies at work here as well. Anyway, she and Peltz are the only two who manage to slip in a camera. They do so illegally, it's against the rules, but obviously the screening is not that strict as two people manage to sneak in photos. This is her photo, so, taken surreptitiously, probably like this or something, or under a garment or something, but this is the photo of people queuing up for water, and you see an interesting mix of refugees. Some, by the way, are still in their, rather tweedy suits. Others have, gone down into bathing suit mode. These are some of the protagonists that Adrien Bosc has been talking about. So here you have an unknown MB from Luxembourg, HB, a German engineer, then Vladi Serge, Victor Serge's son, then Jacques Remy, the filmmaker, a Belgian law student, Victor Serge. And again, this was at the Conklin Museum in Germany. Some artists, interestingly, cameras not allowed, but easels and paintbrushes were. So some artists painted the camp. This is a German communist artist by the name of Karl Heidenreich, who had been a German volunteer in the Republican ranks against Franco in Spain. Up to then, he'd always done very somber, abstract paintings. I should have shown you an example. Trust me on this, you can Google him. Abstract and very dark. And then all of a sudden, he reinvents himself in the sun of Martinique, drawing things that are almost worthy of Aoul Dufy or something like that, right? The exposure to the sun. What's interesting is, although all these people left one camp for another, they all do feel like they're out of harm's way once they arrive in Martinique. I've got one story of somebody who was going to be sent back to France. But then the end of the route occurs and he never is. So everybody who's reached Martinique is indeed safe. And a lot of these paintings and pictures are indeed suggesting that, internment conditions are not joyous. It's not summer camp. It's harsh. Germain Kuhl calls it a concentration camp in the sun. But by and large, they are leaving behind far worse conditions in Europe. So this is Antonin Peltz drawing the bunk in which they're interned. There's also this incredible dialogue that emerges. And this is at the heart of the latter part of my book. It's also at the heart of Adrien Bosc's novel. It's the encounter that takes place between surrealists on the one hand and the apostles of negritude on the other hand. So René Ménil, Suzanne Césaire, and Aimé Césaire. The surrealists include, in addition to Breton, André Masson. And Masson, as you can see from this drawing, is deeply inspired by local forms, but also by his encounter with Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, who are elaborating their own vision of negritude at this time. In Masson's drawings, you have Martinique embodied, anthropomorphized, sometimes almost telluric, belonging to the earth. Here, body shapes heaving like the volcano of the Montagne Pelée. So again, this is also a story of artists, right? This is the famed disciple of Picasso and star in his own right, Wilfredo Lam, standing here with Helena Holzer, his then spouse, both of them having fought for the Republican cause in Spain against Franco. Holzer, as I recall, was treating soldiers with tuberculosis. Lam was fighting with his paintbrush, creating posters for the Republican cause. Obviously, they had to leave Spain after Franco won. They find themselves in southern France. They end up on the Pont de Mer, and here they are interned. Lazaret, you see that they have some flowers at their feet, conditions again Spartan, but on average acceptable. This is perhaps Wilfredo Lam's greatest masterpiece, held at the MoMA, which some of you will recognize, The Jungle. I argue in my book that it bears the imprint of his walks with the Césaires and the Ménil, and René Ménil in the forest of Absalon outside of Fort-de-France. I don't have time to get into my evidence for this. You're just going to have to trust me or read my book. So this is one of the fruits of this synergy. The journal that André Breton discovers, and he has a sort of mise en scène of the discovery, right? It's almost a surrealist encounter of this wonderful periodical that is thumbing its nose at the Vichy authorities, and that is going to become the vessel for this encounter between surrealism on the one hand and negritude on the other, the journal Tropique. So this is just one of my translations of one article in Tropique by René Ménil, a 1943 issue, one of the later ones. The dictator spoke of abundance in front of his 20 million hypnotized listeners. At the end of the speech, the psychological engineers projected a giant four-leaf clover into the sky. The dictator added, "You will be the conquistadors of the modern age." Well, not much is needed to substitute the four-leaf clover with a swastika and the engineers with Goebbels, right? It's a thinly veiled critique. You also have thinly veiled critiques that work through the image of slavery. I didn't have time to give you that many examples, but again, you have to trust me on this. All right, more artwork that I don't have time to get into. I did want to say a word about how this all ends. And one of the things I haven't mentioned is State Department paranoia. The U.S. is absolutely persuaded, and again, Adrien Bosc's novel does a wonderful job with what the French call bobards, false rumors. There are all these false rumors circulating around these boats about what might be on board, about who might be on board. Well, some of these get, echoes get transmitted as far as Washington, and very quickly rumors abound in the halls of the State Department that there are wolves in sheep's clothing on board. That some of these people with German-sounding last names, well, they might not be Jewish, they might be Gestapo agents. So by April and May 1941, the Americans asked the Dutch to intercept one of these boats, the Winnipeg. They bring it to Trinidad. They interrogate over days and weeks everybody on board, and of course, they don't stumble upon any Nazis. In fact, I have evidence of only one Nazi on these boats, and he had changed his sides. He'd been a Nazi in the early 30s in Austria, and by the time he reached Martinique, he was a violent anti-Nazi, and he in fact joins the Free French. So I have no evidence of an active Nazi on board these boats, only a former Nazi. Yet, you have these titles. Life magazine ran a title that said, Martinique's exports include rum, its imports include Nazi agents masquerading as refugees. And then, of course, this fairly unambiguous title to the Washington Post, the Gestapo rules Martinique, say the refugees. So some of the refugees aren't helping the cause of other refugees in this way. I wanted to show as well this slide that Adrien provided, which is, remind me, Adrien, this is Jacques Rémy. And this is on board the Paul Le Merle, is that right? No, it's after.
It's after when they went to Guyane.
This is after, okay, afterwards on the Guyane. There's all of these ramifications because some end up in Mexico, some end up in New York, some end up in Guyana, some end up in the Dominican Republic, some end up in Argentina or Brazil. So there's this remarkable diaspora from these different voyages. And then, of course, this picture that Adrien Bosc took of the fort just south of the Lazaret. There were two camps. One was Balata, which still stands, received the fewest refugees. The Lazaret was mostly razed and then made way for a hotel, but the camp, the fortress just to the south of it still stands today. And I think there's zero knowledge of this on location. When I spoke to people about this in Martinique, I was told they knew nothing of it. So there's questions of memory and forgetting as well that are inscribed in this story.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's time for us to move forward to questions, right? Alice, we have 15 minutes
I think we should open it up right now to
please,
questions for other people.
Well, I have a question for, can you hear me? I have a question for Adrien. As a writer to writing dialogue of people that are real, how do you shift through public documents of their writing, of their own writing, possibly private letters, and how do you create dialogue and narrative of people that also may change throughout the book? What is your process of creating voices for them?
That's a good question because all my novel I avoid a lot of dialogues. I don't really use dialogues. I use a lot of We said discours rapporté or speech. We said like when we use a part of something we heard from, like I discover in a letter, as you said, or in a book as Levi-Strauss, and create a speech, but not directly. There is no false, because I hate the idea of a false theater of fiction. So I always avoid this kind of dialogues with maybe one or two in the book, but really because I know that there is some answer I know from letters or from text. So I always try to work on this line between fiction and non-fiction, and I think dialogue is really a risk to create false information or to. That's why I always try to not to use a lot of dialogues in my book. So more description, more scene, more explanation of the moment.
Quotations too.
Quotation too.
In italics, right? Most of the time. Quotations. Someone else?
Thinking, no.
Yeah.
Sort of
Questions? Yes.
interior
Oh.
dialogue.
Yes.
Stephanie.
Interior there.
Hi. So I just have a very quick question about Breton. Why didn't he go to Mexico? I was just curious since he had just been in Mexico with his wife, and then it's so interesting. So he was on the boat with his wife as well, since his little girl was there too. So I was just curious, and I was also curious. This is just I just bought your book, so I'll see when it arrives. But do you use footnotes then, or do you, since you do so much archival research? I was just curious if you use the citations or like historians do, or
Quotation.
Quotation.
Citation, c'est ça?
Citation et des notes.
For the travel of Breton and Lambert, Jacqueline Lambert, so they went to Mexico. So they went to Mexico with the so they went to during the travel they went to New York and they lived in New York. And then they saw some people in Mexico, but after, I think, right. And I think not during the, maybe after the war.
Late 30s. It was the late 30s, I believe.
Maybe. Maybe, but you know there is a letter of Frida Kahlo who said that André Breton is the worst people on earth, like the worst people on earth. She hates Breton.
She thought he was particularly sexist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. No, I was curious why they didn't come back. I was just curious.
Why they decided to go in New York?
No, why they ended up on the boat.
Well, that's
Instead of going,
partly
yeah.
because there were so few options left, right?
So they couldn't go to the
No, it was hard to get out at all. And people were navigating different options, and they were paying, I think I say in the book, 5 times more than they were in 1939 for tickets on board these pretty dreadful-looking boats. So getting out was the #1 priority, and people, yeah, I mean, if it was Lisbon or Palestine or Shanghai or Martinique, Breton felt like many intellectuals that he was on a list. Virtual or real.
And about the question of quotes in the book, citation, I use, particularly in this book, I decided to use italic instead of our font. Also, when there is like quote, and at the end of the book, you have all the notes to say when it's directly a quotation for a dialogue, for a sentence, and it creates that I explain about the idea of collage and the idea of cut up of different parts of montage in a way.
Very interesting. Thank you.
This is wonderful. I am wondering, you talked very interestingly about how you reckon with history, but I wonder how you reckon with fiction, because there are such a lot of allegorical ships in European fiction and philosophy, but even in popular culture and film, the ship of fools, how do you deal with the resonance, perhaps, of even popular fiction and film and other narratives that people would be thinking of in this moment?
I think, of course, there is like, I don't know to explain, but there was a lot of reading before, of course, but reading from the past, from the Odyssey, from the Iliad, but also from one of the passengers inside, Anna Segers, because she wrote one of the best books about the idea of this kind of travel, the fear also, because the beginning of Transit is about one of the boats destroyed by a patrol, because there was also this risk for this passenger. So there was all this bibliography, in a way, of novel, of poem also, really important in a way, but also like cultural background, like popular also with cartoon, also with all the images we have in France with Tintin and all the boat, but all because it's really this time and you have all this kind of character mysterious inside the cartoon, and also because there is an example really funny in the book, but it's true, and it's the irony of the history, but there is an amazing story that when Levi-Strauss escaped from Martinique, he went to Saint-Domingue, Puerto Rico. To Puerto Rico. And as Eric explained, there is a lot of rumors and a lot of fears from the American authority about this kind of passenger. So there is also the FBI in charge to investigate about some passenger in Puerto Rico. And they found all the books of Levi-Strauss and all the notes in Brazil with the Indians. And they thought it was like a mysterious code, like a Nazi code, or so they put him in prison, like an hotel prison, during 3 days. And I can't explain because it's too long, but there is like really like the same story as in a famous Tintin book is Le Temple du Soleil, Sun Temple, and because they were in jail in the cartoon, and they read newspaper, and in the newspaper they saw the story of an eclipse, and they create this false apparition of the sun, and that was kind of the same kind of story, because he read on the newspaper that Jacques Soustel, head of the resistance, was in travel in Puerto Rico, and he used that to the FBI to say, ask Jacques Soustel to come, he will explain. So that's why.
Okay, yes. So you're
Okay. As for Adrien, as a writer of historical fiction, when you go and visit places that are in your books, like Martinique, when you visited the camps, what are the most important details for you to note about the place? Do you make maps of the place? Do you take a lot of pictures? Do you talk to locals? What's your plan for visiting on site?
I think I don't have plan when I decided to go just to see the place. It's like I explained that in the first book, Constellation, because there was this mountain in Azores Island, the mountain of the crash, and it was like at the beginning I thought it was really to understand and to see the landscape, to see the forest, to have the feeling of the temperature of the everything I can collect, also to use and to be close with the truth of the country. But at the end, I have this feeling that it was like a weird pilgrim on the seat of death, and it was the same thing in Martinique. Also to go, and Eric explained that Lazare. All the local, there is no local who knows that Lazare exists. It's behind a destroyed, horrible hotel of mass tourism, and there is like it really became like a kind of forest for junkies here in this part of the island. So it creates, for me, it's really interesting because it creates something I didn't know before going, really new, this weird part, like the weird feelings of a pilgrim. So it's really interesting for the writing. So in this case, I begin to write and to take a lot of notes, but not like documentation, but more writing during this time. So I think it's really an important part of the books. So for example, for the last one in Spain, I make all the travel in the same condition and walk. But I know that there is no thing I can learn during this travel, but maybe to feel something about the river, about the place of every city, and to have a to be closer with the story.
Questions? We have time for one or two questions.
I had a question in listening to the discussion of the type of hardcore historical research that can go into a work of fiction. I found myself thinking about the inverse. So I have a question for Professor Jennings. Just how you grapple with the process of bringing, if not fictional, at least creative or personal elements to your work in history. And I don't know exactly what my question is, but how should historians think about that element of writing fact?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I was grappling with, surrealist poets, painters, all expressing themselves in different ways. And what do I do with these objects as a historian? I was also, one of the things that obsessed me when I was preparing the research was I was aware from different data that there were about 5,000 people on board. And then there are about 100 people who are famous and leave letters and paintings and so on. And so just like Adrien and Bosc, I too was wondering about the children on board, right? So I have this testimony from Renée Bartsch, who is a German Jewish, the daughter of a German Jewish doctor, Mina Flacke. Anyway, the daughter and mother combo are busy on board saying, conditions aren't safe for kids. There's nothing to keep them from falling overboard. The food is terrible. Then they get to the Lazare and they say, there's no latrines. At the very least, we should be burying our stool. So there's all of these things. But at the end of the day, what do you do with the ordinary people who aren't even described by these? So that was one of my constant concerns. So I tried, I mentioned Mina Flacke and Renée Bartsch because they have an eye for those who were silent on board. Groups of women who were, together at dinner time and weren't talked about by Levi-Strauss, and even less by André Breton. And one of the few things that I got about these groups of women is that they interestingly crossed boundaries. You had, an Austrian Jewish woman dining with a Spanish Republican woman, dining with a Martinican woman. And you could only guess about what they were saying to each other. So my biggest challenge was, I was integrating creative artists, but it was also about what to do with the non-creative artists and how to try to retrieve their voices, which, I don't know you can ever fully do, but I sort of did it by refraction, if that makes sense.
Yes, thanks for a very interesting session. So when I think of all these brilliant artists, writers, intellectuals thrown together on a boat, nothing to do, ending up interned in this concentration camp in the sun, I automatically imagine this is a great opportunity for some sort of cross-fertilization, exchange. I'm sure there's this highly romanticized view of this for people who are just trying to survive, but was this in any way an opportunity for them?
I think it's we said l'ironie d'histoire is historical irony in a way that Eric explained that the conversation between Wilfred Olam, André Breton, for example, and Aimé Césaire, Suzanne Césaire. It's exactly what Vichy states wanted to avoid to to destroy this kind of mix, this kind of conversation between two cultures, three cultures. They said artistes dégénérés, this kind of new creation. And during the travel, of course, there is a lot of conversation between André Breton and Levi-Strauss, but Levi-Strauss at this time was an anonymous on the boat. It was not already the Levi-Strauss we know of les structures élémentaires de la parenté and Triste Tropique. He was a young student in a way, finishing his.
Wanted to become a novelist, right?
We wanted to become a novelist. So there is all this for him. It was André Breton was a star in a way. So he began to talk with him and write a letter to him during the travel about the idea of the documentation and le statut de l'œuvre d'art du document. It's a question in a letter, like a dissertation about the idea of a document, if the document is a piece of art. So it's exactly our conversation about historic and a novel. They have this conversation on boat, and there is an answer of André Breton. So they create the condition of conversation, and also in Martinique, Eric explained really exactly the consequence for Vichy ideology, that they create the first edition of Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal in US, because after the conversation in Martinique, in Fort-de-France, when André Breton arrived in US, he wanted to publish the first book of Aimé Césaire, Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal, and found an American publisher. So they emphasize the export, like an exportation of the culture and the negritude. So that's a funny thing when you want to destroy something, you create a condition to.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly add two things to that. One is what Adrien was just mentioning is the creation of a kind of popular university on board where they're asking these deep philosophical questions. He mentions in the novel that it's an université populaire du pauvre le maire. There's a really interesting sort of freie Universität thing going on where they're conducting seminars. But these seminars are also fractured, right? People are excluded from them. And one of the wonderful testimonies of Jacques Rémy is to show that socioeconomic divides are replicated. So there's a Belleville, there's a Champs-Élysées. And so, as much as you would try to have a community of equals, it doesn't happen. The other unintended consequence, of course, is the one we talked about, the encounter of surrealism and negritude. And I want to highlight an additional irony there, which is that not only do they achieve this marvelous synergy, they do so by fooling and duping Vichy. So one of the characters that pops up in both your novel and my nonfiction is the lieutenant de vaisseau Belle, who is at the head of the censorship bureau for Vichy Martinique. He's been reading the pages of Tropique, and he sees this stuff, and he says, well, this is talking about how blacks should be more authentic, and how, so I'm all for authenticity. I think the French should be more authentic. And he's fooled by it. And so, his final letter to the Césaires basically says, you have duped me. I thought you were, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I thought you were like Frédéric Mistral for Provence, but you're not. You're a nationalist, and you're dangerous. And you're a black nationalist. And so there's this sort of swindling that's going on that I think is really interesting as well. Anyway.
Anyone final question?
Okay. Well, on behalf of French and Italian, thank you for coming. But I see a lot of our French students out here in the audience, graduate and undergraduate. And I wondered if you would both speak a little bit to something that maybe we can't see. Adrien, we're making you speak in English, which is obviously not your native language. What role did language play in your research? Because obviously there are many languages, as you mentioned, Eric. How many languages did you need to know to be able to do this authentically? And were there barriers, like I don't do German that well. I mean, did you find there were places that you couldn't go in your writing because of those language barriers?
That's a good question, and I think there was a lot of layers inside or a document you find of French language, like on the archives for Martinique a lot of passengers inside, but there was also the Spanish one, there was a German one, there was a Czech, there was a lot of different people. So I asked when it was too hard for me to understand some people, friends, and to make I don't know, simple translation. Also to understand some parts of, for example, Enela Holzer wrote a book to explain, and it was impossible for me to understand. So I asked a German friend to summarize, to tell me what pages, and then ask her to translate the page I wanted really to read. So that maybe the main difference between historical and novel is that I didn't have the proper source or the proper translation. It's always amateur in a way.
I struggled with this a lot because of the incredible mosaic on board, right? So fortunately, I have high school German, or had, because high school was a long time ago, complemented by years of Goethe Institute German. Thank you, Goethe Institute. But I mean, I still struggled, and to the point where when I got to Frankfurt and started working in the Exil archive, I hired a local MA student to help me out because I was just going too slowly. You know, I can read the stuff, but if it takes you an hour to read a letter, you're not going to get very far. So I had help, just as Adrien mentioned. I also hired a PhD student in the Italian department to help me with the writings of one Montagnano, who is an Italian anti-fascist on board, who makes it on board, and then they threatened to send him back. He's the one I was alluding to. And to be truthful, I mean, you know, I went to Prague, had some Prague local students, and a researcher at the National Archive, at the National Gallery, helped me with the painter Antonin Peltz. But it was a limit, and the most obvious example is the Spaniards on board. Maybe 40% of the refugees were Spanish, and I've only got 3 or 4 Spanish characters in there. And that's because I don't have the language skills to really grapple with that. And there's a whole subtopic on the Spanish Republicans on board that deserves better treatment. So it's another book.
Please join us, Alison, before thanking Eric and Adrien for this wonderful discussion. Thank you both. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you all for attending the event. Thank you.
Ouais, génial. C'est la connais,